When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, but not from fear of being caught. From the terror that he would see those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I tried to snatch the phone from his hands, but he pulled it back smoothly and kept reading. I watched his face change as he read line by line, feeling my life crumble in mere seconds. Yes, now he would learn the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled as he scrolled further, and I knew right now he would reach that message that would destroy my life. That one message that would explain everything and put an end to it all. Or maybe confuse him even more. My phone suddenly vibrated in his hands, and a new notification appeared on the screen. I saw his face turn pale as he read the sender's name. My husband froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when I'm nervous. My nerves mixed with the horror of realizing what I had done. His breathing quickened. I could hear it even from the 6 feet separating us. This was exactly what I feared most. Because 3 months ago I made a mistake that changed absolutely everything forever, and now. I didn't know what to do, but let me tell you how it really was. Before I share with you the secret I tried so carefully to hide for so long, write in the comments what city you're watching this video from, and answer this question: have you ever had a secret you tried to hide with all your might, but ultimately failed? I never thought my life was particularly unhappy until I met him. At 47, I had what most people would consider a successful existence, a tenured position teaching American literature at the university, a beautiful colonial home in the suburbs, and a husband whose investment firm provided us with more than enough comfort. Yet standing in my kitchen that Tuesday morning, watching Richard hurry through his usual breakfast routine while scrolling through market reports on his tablet, I felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness that I couldn't quite name. The Hendersons are having their annual barbecue next weekend, I mentioned, stirring honey into my tea. Margaret called yesterday. Mom, Richard responded without looking up, his attention fixed on fluctuating stock prices. This had become our morning ritual, me attempting conversation while he absorbed the financial world's overnight developments. 23 years of marriage had taught me not to take it personally, but lately, the silence felt heavier, more pronounced. I found myself studying his profile, the way his graying hair caught the morning light, wondering when we had stopped really seeing each other. At the university, my afternoon was dedicated to preparing for the upcoming field trip to the Thoreau Institute. These educational retreats were something I genuinely enjoyed, getting students out of the sterile classroom environment, watching them engage with literature in a more natural setting. As I reviewed the participant list, one name caught my attention more than it should have: Alex Morrison. Alex was a senior in my contemporary American authors seminar, unusually mature for his 22 years. Unlike his peers who seemed more interested in their phones than Kerouac, he asked thoughtful questions, challenged interpretations, and wrote papers that demonstrated genuine intellectual curiosity. There was something about his presence in class that I had begun to notice, the way he listened intently when I spoke, how his dark eyes seemed to follow my movements around the room. I dismissed these observations as professional pride. After all, isn't every teacher pleased when a student shows real engagement? But as I prepared the materials for our 3-day retreat, I found myself wondering what conversations might emerge when freed from the formal constraints of the classroom. The afternoon dragged with faculty meetings and administrative paperwork. Professor Williams droned on about budget cuts while I doodled absent-mindedly in my notebook margins. Through the conference room window, I watched students crossing the quad, their youth and energy a stark contrast to the institutional beige walls surrounding me. When had I become so acutely aware of the passage of time? Driving home, I passed the coffee shop where Richard and I used to meet during our dating years. The sight triggered a memory of how he used to look at me then, with genuine interest, real desire. Now our conversations revolved around logistics, who would pick up the dry cleaning, whether we needed to call the landscaper, when his next business trip was scheduled. That evening, Richard was late for dinner again. I ate alone, rereading one of Alex's recent essays about isolation in Salinger's work. His insights were remarkably perceptive, exploring themes of disconnection and longing with an emotional intelligence that surprised me. As I made notes in the margins, I realized I was looking forward to discussing his ideas during the retreat more than I had anticipated anything in months. When Richard finally arrived home at nearly 10 o'clock, I was already in bed with a book. "Sorry, sweetheart," he said, loosening his tie. The Peterson account needed immediate attention. I nodded, not looking up from my pages. We had become experts at this dance of polite indifference, each absorbed in our separate worlds. As he moved around the bedroom getting ready for bed, I wondered if he ever felt the growing distance between us, or if I was the only one conscious of how we had drifted into parallel lives that rarely intersected. Sleep came reluctantly that night, my mind restless with thoughts I couldn't quite organize. Tomorrow would bring the usual routine, classes, grading, the comfortable predictability of academic life. But somehow, the prospect of the upcoming retreat lingered in my consciousness, carrying with it a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in years. The bus ride to the Thoreau Institute began like any other field trip, students chattering excitedly, backpacks stuffed haphazardly in overhead compartments, the familiar smell of diesel fumes and institutional vinyl seats. I had claimed my usual spot near the front, teacher materials spread across my lap, when Alex approached. "Professor, would you mind if I sat here?" I brought some questions about the Emerson readings. His request seemed innocent enough, and I gestured to the empty seat beside me. What followed was 2 hours of the most engaging intellectual conversation I had experienced in months. Alex's understanding of transcendentalist philosophy went far beyond typical undergraduate analysis. He spoke about Thoreau's concept of deliberate living with a passion that reminded me why I had fallen in love with literature in the first place. "Do you think it's possible to truly live deliberately in modern society?" he asked, his voice low enough that our conversation remained private despite the bus full of students. "That's the eternal question, isn't it?" I replied, finding myself leaning slightly closer to hear him better. Thoreau had the luxury of Walden Pond. Most of us have mortgages and responsibilities. "But maybe that's just an excuse," he said, his dark eyes meeting mine directly. "Maybe we convince ourselves we're trapped when really we're just afraid of what deliberate living might cost us." The intensity in his gaze made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite define. There was something about the way he looked at me, not with the casual respect most students showed, but with genuine interest, as if my thoughts mattered beyond their academic value. I turned my attention back to my notes, but I could feel his presence beside me for the remainder of the journey. The Thoreau Institute sat nestled among towering pines, a rustic collection of cabins and meeting halls designed to evoke 19th-century simplicity. As students unloaded their bags and explored their accommodations, I handled the administrative details of check-in, grateful for familiar routines to ground me. The afternoon session went smoothly. We gathered in the main hall where I led discussions about nature writing and its relevance to contemporary environmental consciousness. Alex participated thoughtfully but didn't seek me out individually, and I began to think I had imagined the intensity of our earlier conversation. Evening brought a more relaxed atmosphere. After dinner, students scattered to their cabins or gathered around the fire pit. I was reviewing the next day's schedule in my room when someone knocked softly on my door. Alex stood in the hallway, hands in his pockets, looking younger than he had on the bus. "I wanted to apologize if I was too intense earlier," he said. "Sometimes I get carried away discussing ideas." "There's nothing to apologize for," I assured him. "Your engagement with the material is exactly what education should be about." We stood there for a moment in the dim hallway lighting, and I became acutely aware of how quiet the building had become. Most students were either asleep or occupied elsewhere, leaving us in an unexpected privacy that felt both natural and dangerous. "I should let you get some rest," he said, but neither of us moved. The silence stretched between us, filled with something I couldn't name. When he finally stepped closer, it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. His hand touched my cheek gently, and I didn't pull away. We kissed. The moment lasted only seconds, but it shattered something fundamental about how I understood myself. When we broke apart, I saw my own shock reflected in his eyes. Without a word, he stepped back and disappeared down the hallway, leaving me standing in my doorway with my heart racing and my entire world suddenly, irrevocably changed. I closed the door and leaned against it, my hand instinctively moving to my lips. 23 years of marriage, and I couldn't remember the last time a kiss had affected me so profoundly. The rational part of my mind began immediately cataloging all the reasons this was wrong, dangerous, impossible. But underneath the panic, something else stirred, a feeling I had almost forgotten existed. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the pressure of Alex's lips against mine, the warmth of his hand on my cheek. By morning, I had convinced myself it was a momentary lapse in judgment, a product of the retreat's isolated atmosphere and my own emotional vulnerability. These things happened. The important thing was to handle it professionally and ensure it never happened again. Breakfast was safely chaotic, filled with the usual morning energy of students fueling up for the day's activities. Alex sat with his classmates at a table across the dining hall, and when our eyes met briefly, he offered only a polite nod. Good, I thought. We were both mature enough to recognize that last night had been a mistake and move forward appropriately. The morning session focused on Thoreau's essay Civil Disobedience, and I threw myself into the discussion with perhaps more intensity than necessary. Talking about principles and moral responsibility felt like solid ground after the uncertainty of the previous evening. Alex participated thoughtfully but maintained appropriate student-teacher boundaries, which should have relieved me. Instead, I found myself hyper-aware of his presence in the room. When he spoke, I listened more carefully than I should have. When he disagreed with another student's interpretation, I noticed the way he formed his arguments with patient respect. When he laughed at someone's joke, the sound seemed to resonate differently than the others. During the lunch break, I walked alone through the pine woods surrounding the institute, trying to clear my head. The forest was peaceful, filled with the kind of natural silence Thoreau had written about so eloquently. I found myself on a narrow trail that led to a small clearing where someone had placed a simple wooden bench. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" I turned to find Alex emerging from the trees behind me. My heart began beating faster, though I couldn't tell if it was from surprise or something else entirely. "I come here when I need to think," he said, approaching slowly. "I discovered it yesterday during free time." "Alex, about last night." "I know," he interrupted gently. "You don't need to say anything. I shouldn't have put you in that position." His maturity surprised me. I had expected awkwardness, perhaps even accusations or complications. Instead, he was offering me an easy exit from an impossible situation. "It's not that simple," I heard myself saying, and immediately regretted the words. "Isn't it?" He moved closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something clean and subtle that suited him perfectly. "You felt it too." I wanted to deny it, to retreat into professional authority and adult responsibility. Instead, I found myself studying his face, noting the way sunlight filtered through the pine branches and cast shadows across his features. He was young, yes, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of depths I hadn't expected. "This is complicated," I said finally. "The best things usually are." We stood in that clearing talking for nearly an hour about everything except what was really happening between us. He told me about his plans after graduation, his hopes for graduate school, his complicated relationship with his family's expectations. I found myself sharing things I rarely discussed, my own academic dreams, the way marriage had gradually narrowed my sense of possibility, my growing awareness that life was passing by while I remained safely contained within familiar boundaries. When we finally returned to the institute, the afternoon session felt surreal. I watched myself leading discussions about American literary rebellion while internally experiencing my own small revolution. Every glance Alex and I exchanged seemed loaded with significance, yet we maintained perfect propriety on the surface. That evening after dinner, several students gathered in the common room for informal discussions. I had planned to retreat to my room, but Alex caught my attention as I was leaving. "Professor, could you settle a debate we're having about the ending of Bartleby?" What followed was an animated group discussion about Melville's story and its implications for modern work culture. I found myself energized by the students' insights, laughing at their jokes, feeling more alive than I had in months. When the conversation finally wound down near midnight, I realized that Alex had orchestrated the entire evening, not for any ulterior motive, but simply because he had noticed something about me that I was only beginning to recognize myself. As students dispersed to their rooms, Alex lingered behind to help stack chairs and clean up. We worked in comfortable silence, and I began to understand that whatever was happening between us was more complex than simple attraction. He saw something in me that had been dormant for years, and his attention was awakening parts of myself I had almost forgotten existed. The question was no longer whether I felt drawn to him, I clearly did. The question was what I intended to do about it. Our final day at the Institute dawned gray and overcast, matching my conflicted mood. During breakfast, I announced that we would spend the morning at Walden Pond itself, giving students time to reflect and write in the actual environment that had inspired Thoreau's most famous work. The bus ride was quieter than our journey up, students tired from 2 days of intensive discussion and late-night conversations. I sat in my usual spot near the front, but this time Alex didn't join me. Instead, he chose a seat several rows back, respecting the distance I thought I wanted. But as mile after mile passed in silence, I found myself missing the intellectual stimulation of our conversations, the way he challenged my ideas and made me see familiar concepts from new angles. Walden Pond was exactly as I had imagined it, serene, timeless, surrounded by woods that seemed untouched by the modern world just beyond their borders. I gave students their assignment to find individual spots around the pond and spend an hour writing reflectively about their experience. Then I found my own secluded area near the water's edge and tried to focus on the peaceful surroundings. Instead, my mind wandered to Richard, probably already at his office despite the early hour, absorbed in whatever crisis demanded his attention today. When had we stopped taking trips together? When had we stopped talking about anything more meaningful than schedules and obligations? I tried to remember the last time he had looked at me the way Alex had looked at me in that forest clearing, with genuine interest and appreciation. "Professor?" I looked up to find Alex standing nearby, notebook in hand. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to share something I wrote." I gestured for him to sit on the fallen log beside me, maintaining what I hoped was appropriate distance while he opened his notebook. "It's about deliberate living," he said, then began reading in his quiet, thoughtful voice. His words were beautiful, exploring the tension between safety and authenticity, between the lives we're expected to live and the ones we secretly desire. As he read, I watched his profile against the backdrop of the pond, noticed the way he paused occasionally to look at me, checking whether his words were landing as he intended. "That's remarkable," I said when he finished. "You've captured something essential about the human condition." "I was thinking about our conversation yesterday," he said, closing the notebook. "About whether it's possible to live deliberately while still fulfilling our responsibilities to others." "And what conclusion did you reach?" That maybe sometimes the most responsible thing we can do is to honor what's authentic in ourselves, even when it's inconvenient or complicated. The words hung between us like a challenge. I knew we weren't really talking about Thoreau anymore, just as I knew that what was happening between us had moved far beyond an inappropriate teacher-student attraction. This young man really saw me, in a way that made me remember who I used to be before I became so careful, so contained, so safe. "Alex," I began, but he shook his head. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know that these few days have meant something to me." "You've meant something to me." The sincerity in his voice broke through the last of my defenses. When he reached out to touch my hand, I didn't pull away. When he leaned closer, I let him. We kissed again, longer this time, with less shock and more intention. When we separated, neither of us pretended this was another mistake. The attraction between us was real, undeniable, and growing stronger despite every rational argument against it. "What happens now?" I asked quietly. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know I don't want this to end just because we're leaving this place." The afternoon bus ride back to campus passed in a blur of conflicted emotions. I sat with Alex again, but this time our conversation was more careful, more aware of the other students around us. We discussed practical things, upcoming assignments, graduation requirements, his graduate school applications. But underneath the academic topics, we were really negotiating the terms of whatever was beginning between us. As we pulled into the university parking lot, I felt the weight of returning to real life, to my marriage, to the carefully constructed boundaries of my professional existence. Alex helped unload equipment from the bus, and when our hands touched briefly as he handed me a box of books, the simple contact sent electricity up my arm. "Thank you for an incredible experience," he said formally, loud enough for other students to hear. "You're welcome," I replied in my professor voice. "I'm glad you found it valuable." But our eyes held each other's gaze a moment longer than appropriate, and I knew this conversation was far from over. Walking to my car, I felt like I was carrying a dangerous secret, something that could explode my life if handled carelessly. Yet for the first time in years, I also felt truly alive. The question that would haunt me all the way home was no longer whether this connection with Alex was wise or appropriate. It clearly wasn't. The question was whether I had the courage to pursue it anyway, and what that choice might ultimately cost me. That drive home from campus felt endless. Every red light gave me more time to think about what I was contemplating. Every mile marker reminded me of the distance I was traveling away from my safe, predictable life towards something I couldn't yet name. By the time I pulled into my driveway, Richard's car was already there, unusual for a Wednesday evening. I found him in the kitchen, jacket loosened, pouring himself a scotch, another unusual midweek behavior. "How was your academic retreat?" he asked without looking up from his glass. "Educational," I replied, the word feeling inadequate for everything that had happened. "Students got a lot out of it." "Good. The Morrison account closed today. Bigger than we expected." I murmured appropriate congratulations while watching him drink, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way he seemed to be avoiding eye contact. Had he always been this much of a stranger, or was I only noticing now because someone else had reminded me what real connection felt like? Over the next few days, I threw myself into grading and class preparation, trying to establish some normalcy. But Alex's presence in my Tuesday seminar was impossible to ignore. He participated as thoughtfully as ever, but now I caught myself studying his hands as he took notes, remembering how they had felt against my face. When class ended and students filed out, he lingered behind. "Professor, I was wondering if you had time to discuss my thesis proposal. I know you're busy, but maybe we could meet somewhere off campus? I find coffee shops less formal for brainstorming." The innocent words carried layers of meaning that made my pulse quicken. I should have suggested office hours, maintained professional boundaries, redirected this conversation before it could become something else entirely. Instead, I heard myself saying, "There's a quiet place downtown. The Corner Cafe on Elm Street. Tomorrow at 4? The next afternoon, I sat in that cafe 15 minutes early, hands wrapped around a coffee cup I wasn't drinking, questioning every decision that had led me to this moment. When Alex arrived, he looked nervous too, which somehow made me feel better about my own uncertainty. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "I wasn't sure you would." I almost didn't. We talked about his thesis proposal for exactly 12 minutes. I know because I kept glancing at my watch, hyper-aware of how this meeting might appear to any observer. But gradually, our conversation shifted to more personal territory. He told me about growing up feeling different from his peers, about finding solace in books when the world felt too harsh or superficial. I found myself sharing memories of my own college years, dreams I had abandoned for the security of marriage and career. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had made different choices?" he asked. "Every day," I admitted, then immediately regretted the honesty. It's not too late, you know, to make different choices. The weight of his words settled between us like a challenge. When he reached across the table and touched my hand, I didn't pull away. When he suggested we walk to his apartment to continue our conversation privately, every rational part of my brain screamed warnings I chose to ignore. His apartment was a typical graduate student's space, books everywhere, mismatched furniture, windows that needed cleaning. But it felt real in a way my perfectly decorated home hadn't in years. We sat on his couch talking about literature, about life, about the growing attraction neither of us could continue pretending didn't exist. When he kissed me this time, I kissed him back without hesitation. When he whispered that he had been thinking about me constantly since the retreat, I confessed the same. When he asked if I wanted to stay, I made a choice that I knew would change everything. We spent the night together. I left his apartment the next morning before dawn, driving through empty streets while my mind raced through a tornado of emotions I couldn't organize. Guilt, certainly. Fear of consequences, absolutely. But underneath those expected feelings was something else, a sense of awakening, of rediscovering parts of myself I had buried under years of routine and responsibility. At home, I showered carefully, changed clothes, and prepared for a normal day as if nothing had happened. Richard was already gone for an early breakfast meeting, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the strange new reality of what I had become, a woman who was cheating on her husband. The word felt harsh, clinical, inadequate for the complexity of what I was experiencing. This wasn't some sordid affair born of physical need or revenge. This was about connection, about feeling truly seen and valued for who I was rather than what I provided. Alex made me remember that I was more than just a wife and professor. I was a complete person with desires and dreams that had been dormant for too long. But as I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee from the same mug I used every morning, looking at family photos that suddenly felt like artifacts from someone else's life, I couldn't ignore the magnitude of what I had done. One night had the power to destroy everything I had built over more than 2 decades. The question was whether I had the strength to walk away from Alex now, before this went any further, or whether I was already too far down a path I couldn't turn back from. My phone buzzed with a text message. "Thank you for last night. When can I see you again?" I stared at the screen for a long moment, thumb hovering over the keyboard. My answer would determine whether this remained a single mistake or became something much more dangerous. I typed back, "Soon." The next few weeks passed in a blur of careful deception and intoxicating secrecy. I perfected the art of compartmentalization, sliding seamlessly between my roles as dutiful wife and passionate lover. Richard noticed nothing, too absorbed in a major acquisition that required long hours and frequent travel. Alex and I developed an elaborate system of coded communications and carefully planned meetings. We met at his apartment, in secluded corners of the university library, once even in a hotel room 2 towns over when paranoia about being recognized locally grew too strong. Each encounter deepened our connection while simultaneously increasing my anxiety about maintaining the facade of my normal life. I found myself studying my reflection more critically, noticing how these stolen hours had changed me. There was color in my cheeks again, a brightness in my eyes that had been missing for years. I bought new underwear, started wearing perfume again, paid more attention to my appearance in ways that made me feel both beautiful and guilty. Richard, when he was home, seemed oblivious to these changes. He kissed my cheek absently while reading emails, made conversation about his work while scrolling through his phone, maintained the same distant politeness that had characterized our relationship for years. I began to wonder if he would notice if I disappeared entirely. But my colleagues at the university were starting to pay attention. Professor Williams commented on how vibrant I seemed lately. Dr. Martinez asked if I had changed my hair. Even my students noticed something different, though they couldn't identify what had shifted in my teaching style. Alex thrived on the secrecy, treating our hidden relationship like an adventure rather than a source of stress. He would find excuses to stop by my office during posted hours, engaging in innocent academic conversations while his eyes promised things that made my heart race. He left carefully crafted notes and books he returned to the library, messages only I would understand. But the constant vigilance was exhausting. Every phone call required careful consideration of who might overhear. Every email needed to be deleted immediately. Every public interaction had to be perfectly calibrated to seem professional while satisfying our growing need for connection. I was living 2 completely separate lives, and the effort of maintaining both was beginning to take its toll. Sleep became elusive as my mind churned through the implications of what I was doing. My appetite disappeared, replaced by a constant low-level anxiety that even the euphoria of being with Alex couldn't entirely dispel. The dangerous part was how natural it had begun to feel. Lying came easier each day. Elaborate explanations for my whereabouts flowed smoothly from my lips. I developed backup stories for my backup stories, constructing an alternate reality so detailed it sometimes felt more real than my actual marriage. But reality has a way of asserting itself, regardless of how carefully we try to control it. The first crack in my carefully constructed deception came on a Thursday evening when Richard arrived home earlier than expected. "Whose car was that leaving our driveway?" he asked casually, hanging up his coat. My blood turned to ice. "What car?" "Dark blue sedan. I passed it at the end of our street. Looked like it had just pulled out of our driveway." I forced my voice to remain steady while my mind raced through possibilities. "Oh, that was probably Mrs. Henderson's nephew. She mentioned he might stop by to pick up those books I promised to lend her." Richard nodded, seemingly satisfied with the explanation. But I caught him looking at me more carefully that evening, studying my face during dinner conversation as if searching for something he couldn't quite identify. That night, lying in bed beside my sleeping husband, I realized that the careful balance I had been maintaining was becoming increasingly fragile. The walls between my 2 worlds were starting to crack, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep them from collapsing entirely. Alex texted me late that night, "Are you okay? You seemed distracted today." I stared at the message for a long time before responding, "We need to be more careful." His reply came immediately, "Or we need to stop pretending this is temporary." That message kept me awake until dawn, forcing me to confront a truth I had been avoiding. What had started as a temporary escape from my mundane life was becoming something much more serious. Alex wasn't content to remain my secret forever, and I was running out of energy to maintain the elaborate deceptions required to keep both relationships alive. Something had to give. The question was what I was willing to sacrifice, and whether I would have any choice in the matter when the time came to decide. The crisis came 3 weeks later, swift and terrifying in its suddenness. Richard had been acting strangely for several days, more attentive than usual, asking detailed questions about my schedule, commenting on little changes in my routine that I thought had gone unnoticed. On Wednesday morning, he announced he would be working from home, something he rarely did. I canceled my planned lunch with Alex, sending a coded text about needing to reschedule our thesis meeting. But Richard's presence in the house felt oppressive, and I found myself jumping at every phone notification, every doorbell, every sound that might require explanation. "You seem nervous," Richard observed over lunch. "Everything okay at work?" "Just the usual end-of-semester pressure," I replied, forcing a smile. "You know how students get when final papers are due." He nodded, but his eyes remained skeptical. That afternoon, while I was grading papers in my study, he appeared in the doorway with my laptop in his hands. "Your computer was making strange noises," he said. "I thought I should check if there's a problem with the hard drive." My heart stopped. I had been careful about deleting emails and text messages, but I wasn't sure what traces might remain in my browser history or cached data. The thought of Richard scrolling through my digital life made me physically sick. "I think it's fine," I said, reaching for the laptop. "Probably just the fan running. Let me take a look. I know more about computers than you do." He settled into the chair beside me, fingers moving across the keyboard with disturbing familiarity. I watched helplessly as he opened browser windows, checked system files, navigated through areas of the computer I rarely accessed myself. "Interesting," he murmured after several minutes. "You've been doing a lot of research on hotels lately." The room seemed to spin around me. I had forgotten about searching for meeting places with Alex, the careful reconnaissance I had done to find locations where we were unlikely to encounter anyone we knew. "Research for what?" I managed to ask. "The browser history shows repeated searches for the Riverside Inn, the Hampton Lodge, several other places within a 50-mile radius." "Are you planning a surprise getaway for us?" His tone was light, almost playful, but there was something underneath it that made my skin crawl. He knew. Maybe not everything, but he knew something was wrong. "I was looking into options for the department retreat next year," I said, the lie flowing smoothly despite my internal panic. "Dr. Williams asked me to research potential venues." Richard nodded slowly, closing the laptop with deliberate care. "That makes sense. Though I'm surprised the university would consider such upscale locations for faculty events." After he left the room, I sat frozen in my chair, trying to calculate how much damage had been done and what I needed to do to contain it. The careful walls I had built between my two lives were crumbling, and I could feel the weight of discovery pressing down on me like a physical force. That evening, Richard was unusually attentive during dinner, asking detailed questions about my day, my students, my upcoming schedule. Every question felt like a trap, every answer a potential confession. When my phone buzzed with a text message, we both looked at it simultaneously. "Aren't you going to check that?" Richard asked when I made no move toward the phone. "It can wait," I replied, but my hands were shaking. "It might be important. Could be the university." With Richard watching, I had no choice but to pick up the phone. The message was from Alex, "Missing you. Can't stop thinking about yesterday." I felt all the blood drain from my face as I read the words, praying that my expression remained neutral. But when I looked up, Richard was studying me with an intensity that told me everything I needed to know. He had seen enough to confirm whatever suspicions had been growing in his mind. The game was over, even if neither of us was ready to acknowledge it yet. "Work emergency?" he asked quietly. "Student question about an assignment," I replied, setting the phone aside without responding to the message. But we both knew that something fundamental had shifted in that moment. The careful balance I had maintained for months was finally, irrevocably broken. The confrontation came the next morning, swift and devastating in its precision. I woke to find Richard sitting in the chair beside our bed, fully dressed, holding my phone in his hands. His face was composed, businesslike, as if he were preparing for a difficult board meeting rather than the destruction of our marriage. "We need to talk," he said simply. I sat up, pulling the blanket around me like armor, though I knew it wouldn't protect me from what was coming. "I've been watching you for weeks," he continued, his voice unnaturally calm. "The late nights, the changed passwords, the way you check your phone constantly. I know the signs of deception. I use them in business negotiations all the time." My mouth felt too dry to speak, but I forced out the words, "Richard, I can explain." "No explanation necessary. I hired someone to follow you 3 weeks ago. I have photographs of you entering that apartment building downtown. I have credit card records showing purchases at restaurants you've never mentioned visiting. I have enough evidence to destroy you professionally and personally." The words hit me like physical blows. All those careful precautions, all that elaborate planning, and he had been watching the entire time, documenting my betrayal with the same methodical approach he brought to his business deals. "But I'm not going to use any of it," he said, and the unexpected mercy in his voice was somehow worse than threats would have been. "Because despite everything, I still love the woman I married, even if I don't recognize her anymore." I started to cry then, huge tears that felt inadequate for the magnitude of what I had destroyed. "Richard, I'm so sorry." "Sorry isn't enough. But it's a start." He stood up, smoothing his tie with practiced efficiency. "I'm going to stay at the downtown hotel for a few days while you decide what you want to do. But understand this, if you choose to stay married to me, this ends completely. No contact, no explanations, no goodbye. If you choose him, I'll make sure the divorce proceedings are as painless as possible, but you'll leave with only what you came into this marriage with." He paused at the bedroom door, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You have until Sunday to decide. After that, I make the choice for both of us." The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid falling into place. I sat alone in our bedroom, surrounded by the carefully curated life we had built together, and tried to comprehend how completely everything had changed in the space of 5 minutes. My phone buzzed with another message from Alex. "Good morning, beautiful. When can I see you today?" I stared at the screen through my tears, realizing that I was about to lose everything, either the security and respectability of my marriage, or the passion and authenticity I had rediscovered with him. There was no path forward that didn't require devastating sacrifice. But as I sat there in the wreckage of my carefully constructed deception, one thought emerged with startling clarity. For the first time in years, I felt completely, terrifyingly alive. The choice Richard had given me wasn't really between him and Alex. It was between safety and authenticity, between the life I had been living and the person I was becoming. I picked up my phone and began typing a message that would determine the trajectory of everything that came next.